I think we have the question. Okay, welcome everyone. Good afternoon. Today we have an NL seminar speaker, Naomi Saphra from NYU. Let me introduce you to Naomi. Naomi's interests relate to NLP learning dynamics, how models learn to encode linguistic structure, and how we can encode useful inductive biases into the training process. Having earned a PhD from University of Edinburgh, they are now a postdoc at NYU. In their spare time, they play roller derby under the name Gaussian Retribution, do stand-up comedy, and shepherd programmers who can't type into the world of code dictation. So let's welcome Naomi.
Okay, hello. Yeah, so today I'm going to be talking to you about where variance comes from during experiments that involve transfer learning, and also broadly like the kinds of experiments that we tend to conduct these days in NLP. So in particular, like a lot of the time people do talk about robustness or reliability. They want to make sure that you actually are able to see how reliable some model, let's say BERT, is. And they do this by seeing if it's actually robust to different fine-tuning runs. So can you switch the fine-tuning seed and the like SGD data order seed and still have good results? And we do find that there is very high variance depending on what your fine-tuning seeds are and your SGD seeds are after the pre-training process. But that's not really enough to understand everything about whether a procedure is robust. So the pre-training procedure is not a single set of parameters that you have learned from, that you've like downloaded off of Hugging Face, right? A pre-training procedure is the actual process by which those parameters are found, and it has its own random seeds. So if this much variance comes from the fine-tuning process, how much variance might be coming from the actual pre-training process? Okay, so this is the paper I'm going to be talking about during the first part of this talk, multiverts. So we're going to talk about how you can look at the robustness of the procedure that produces BERT. So there are three sources of variance in general when you're looking at a transfer learning setting, like we often do. So there's your pre-training seed, which we'll say is S sampled from some distribution M. Then you have a fine-tuning seed after your pre-trained model is actually trained. And then there's the test sample itself. So what is your actual robustness to the particular set of data that you are looking at test time? So pre-training, fine-tuning, oh yeah, go on.
So I can think of a few other sources of variance. Are we going to just not cover those? Is that the way to go?
Yeah, so I think that certainly you can say, okay, well, there's the training data, there's the pre-training data. When I say seed, it could cover a lot of different things itself. For now, we're really talking about what happens in domain, and we're really talking about and so we're really just looking at like what happens at each stage. So you can say pre-training has some amount of variance, and let's say that, like, we can say that the pre-training data can be sort of absorbed into the, like, what is the seed question, and same with the fine-tuning data. And so the reason why we're talking about test sample separate from seed is because there is no real seed at test time to analyze other than the actual data source. Did you come up with any other sources of noise that I haven't just now?
Well, there's things like choosing the batch size and like the way you do tokenization is going to affect things, but I think in the same vein as what you're talking about, it's good to.
I would actually classify those as part of the procedure rather than part of the sources of variance.
Okay.
So you would choose a particular tokenization scheme based on whatever criteria you've chosen it under, and this is something you could actually use to test. Is this a good tokenization scheme, right?
Tokenization, yes. Batch, though, that ends up being a kind of a convenience thing, and the interaction with the seed is like.
Yes, still hyperparameters are like, you'll have whatever selection criteria for your hyperparameters. One thing that you do not want to have during your like hyperparameter tuning procedure is selecting out random seeds that do well, because that's not going to give you any kind of like robust procedure, right? So yeah, those are the sources of variance we're really going to talk about, one at each stage. Yeah.
So when you say variance, you're talking about variance of the loss or the accuracy, or what's the variable?
I am talking about, let's say, variance of performance, which could be loss, accuracy, or whatever other performance metric you're interested in that would vary according to model quality. So you might be interested in some sort of out of distribution generalization metric even. It doesn't have to be just like a metric that's in domain, like in domain accuracy. And we'll address that, yeah. So, okay, so we want to measure the effect of the pre-training seed, which is kind of difficult because it's very expensive to pre-train a model. So part of this project was that we released 25 pre-trained BERT instances that are approximately BERT. And so those are public and you can use them, and 5 of them actually include intermediate checkpoints. So you can also investigate the training dynamics by looking at those. So they have like a bunch of early checkpoints and then more checkpoints further on in training. So, so when we want to check the robustness of a procedure, we actually want to do something that is very standard in every field that isn't machine learning, where we apparently are all supposed to have a statistics background, but you know, which is that we are trying to just perform like a really basic hypothesis test. In other fields, you have arguments about what is a good way to perform a hypothesis test, whether we should be doing frequentist approaches, what's the problems that you run into with p-hacking and stuff. And in machine learning, we like don't do that because we're like you're basically a hero if you've run your test 5 times, right? So we want to estimate the distribution of the error so that we can actually compute some kind of confidence interval, so that we can actually consider whether a intervention or a particular procedure outperforms a different thing, right? So in order to do that, we're going to estimate the loss empirically, which we do using the Multibootstrap. So first off, you sample some pre-trained seeds with replacement, some seeds for pre-training with replacement, which is sort of like done implicitly in the multi-BERT setups. So you would just use those pre-training, but this is also broad. So if you wanted to test a pre-training intervention, you would do something like this as well. Like if you wanted to make an alteration to the pre-training process, you sample your test sets, and then you calculate your empirical loss. So this way we have an idea of what the actual robustness across different test sets is of a pre-training procedure, also across different seeds. So
Wait,
yeah.
sorry, in that last equation, I only see you going over X. I don't see you going over. Where, well, you have F sub S. What is F sub S?
F sub S is our, is like the function produced by a seed.
But it's only the S, right? Oh, sorry. That's the what is, okay, so you go seeds from 1 through n sub s. I'm not sure I understand that notation.
So this is, this is a like, so this is the loss for a like particular, this is like your empirical loss based on a particular like a particular seed. And so you're just looking at like so you're actually like produce, so f sub s is the like function that is produced using that seed, using all of the like data at the input, and then you're computing the loss over a set of over like a set of possible test sets.
Yeah, that I get, right?
Yeah.
It's the integration with the different tree training seeds that I don't see specifically. So this is just one of them, right? This is for one training seed.
Yeah. So we do in fact, so like you look at it over, so you are doing this with like, while simultaneously sampling the random seeds for pre-training. So like.
So for each randomly sampled test set, you are also randomly sampling a pre-training seed?
Yeah.
Oh, okay, that's interesting.
Oh, so no, sorry. You are like.
Not coordinated.
So you are taking an average that is over both like the actual like pre-trained models.
Yeah.
And you are also, yeah, oh, yes. Now I understand what you're saying. Yes, that is it. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay, so the procedure, so when you want to compare this to a fixed baseline, there are multiple ways that you can actually use something like this. So you are, wait, let me clarify that like one way to think about this is that you are sampling over like set of variables that are simultaneously just like sample a pre-trained seed out, and this is with replacement, and simultaneously like a test set. Yeah.
You're saying choose one of each.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is like, I'll just, yeah.
Is the test set also sampled from like your whatever test set you have like with replacement?
Yeah. So yeah, exactly.
Hence the multi-bootstrap name.
Yeah, exactly. Everything is with replacement. So yeah, you think of it as like these are that you think of it as like a variable that's just a set of variables. Everything is sampled. Yeah.
So everything you said so far is about in domain, right? Because there is its own variance which
Yes.
comes later. Okay.
Yeah, don't worry. We will talk about out of domain behavior. So let's there are several like ways that you can apply this kind of thing. One thing is if you wanted to compare an intervention you've performed or a particular procedure to a fixed baseline. So you can so in general, you can compare this to like a single point estimate that's produced by a different model. So for instance, if you have these like 25 different BERT instances, you can compare, you can see whether they're like an outlier, whether they are actually, reasonably aligned with the original BERT. And in general, they are, although QQP, they're a little like off from clearly the original BERT falls out of the distribution. So in general, though, they actually are like performing fairly similar to BERT on each of these like different fine-tuned tasks.
So is each cube in the histogram just a single element of multi-BERTs run on the entire test set, or are you doing the multi-bootstrap sampling for that?
Yeah. Yeah, this is over, let me see, this plot, how is this produced? This is like 25, yeah, this is over like all 25 different multi-BERT.
Just a full test set.
Yeah, this is just over the full test. Although it's like, so this isn't actually like performing like a bootstrap. This is each of this is an average. I'm just sort of visualizing a thing, but this is not actually an application of like this visual is not like.
Right, you're not doing a statistical.
Is not a significance test, yeah. So so comparison of paired samples is another thing you might want to do. So in this case, you want to look at whether a particular intervention is actually changing behavior. So that means that you need to look at you need to compare what happens in the like with the same pre-training seed across different interventions, for instance. Yeah. So so you are actually just looking at the impact of this intervention, and you can like get this out of the bootstrap estimation error based on these sampling with replacement procedures. But and then you can also, so then one example of how you can do this is you can like perform some kind of debiasing procedure, and you can say, does this actually remove bias based on the actual like bias metric across different like for the same instance, the same pre-training seed, are we actually removing bias?
Can you give an example of intervention?
Yeah, so the intervention here is like a debiasing process called CDA, like incremental. So this is just like a debiasing process. So then the question is just, what is the performance on winner gender in the situation where you perform this kind of procedure versus the situation where you do not perform that kind of procedure? So that's an intervention.
But an intervention could be, I mean, in this, I'm not sure. In this case, does the intervention remove data, or is it just a model intervention? Forget, I don't care. Actually, what it really matters is that it can be a data augmentation or removal.
Oh, yeah.
Right? That happens all the time.
Yeah.
And then locking it to the seed seems kind of meaningless, right?
Well, but let's say that you're doing this after pre-training, right?
Yeah.
So let's say that you have a pre-trained model, then the actual then you're definitely going to need to consider the role of the pre-training seed.
Yeah.
And also, I wouldn't say that it's like completely meaningless to compare what happens with like the same seed. I think that is a assertion that you would need to actually test, because there definitely are seeds that are better than others. And so the question of whether a seed is always better than another seed, like across some particular intervention, like whether or not you perform some particular intervention, is, yeah, that's going to be a that's going to be a significant like that is an actual question. I think it is not a like given. Whoops.
Question. Hi, question. So are the seeds the only difference between all those 25 checkpoints? So rest everything guaranteed to be exactly the same except the pre-trained seed.
Yeah, so when in this case, when I'm saying like it's different, like it's like the same seed or different seeds, in that case it just means like the pre-trained model comes from a particular like seed. Yeah. So here, so CDA, to answer your question, is like is when you just add some training where you augment the data by like doing gender swaps, right? So when you do that, then you have a like, so when you do that, then you can see like, yeah, there is an actual like a significant shift in bias, right? Because your p-value is, yeah. And so you like, so when you have a very tiny p-value, you can say, okay, like actually this intervention did make a difference. And then another thing you would want is maybe you can't, like when you can't say the seed is significant, or you can't actually perform an intervention consistently, but like, and you're not testing a single intervention, that you can always be like, this is what would have happened if I hadn't done it. This is what would have happened when I had done it. You can have unpaired samples. So you can still perform an intervention. You can, and then you can just treat the two different sets as like two different sets, and to say, okay, this, like, let's say that you're comparing two different model training procedures, and they aren't like paired in a clear way, in the same way. You just want to say this model training procedure and that model training procedure have, like, one of them is better than the other, right? So in that case, you can train unpaired samples. You can compare unpaired samples in this way, as long as you can assume that the error that's due to having different pre-training seeds is actually like independent between the two different like, say, model architectures that form F and F prime.
Right, I can't remember. Is it the primes that are the interventions, and then the hat is is that the mean minus the individual element?
Yeah, but also it's like, it's like in this case, maybe you're just comparing two different model architectures or something like that, right?
Yeah, but the intervention is the prime.
Yeah.
So you're saying that okay. Yeah.
So I mean, in this case, you're, yeah, so here, like, you would say the intervention is what happens with F prime, yes. Okay, so you would take these two different sets of, oh, yeah, go on.
Yeah, I'm just trying to understand the goal here. So you're not tuning for a seed. You're already taking a bunch of pre-trained models which already had some seeds. At some point, do you go back and retrain them based on the best seed or something?
Well, you can use this same method while you're looking at, like, if you have a particular pre-training procedure that you think, okay, this is going to actually be like a good pre-training procedure, let's say, like anything. You can use this method even if you're not like using the multi-BERTs model set. It's just that there's also, a model set if you wanted to make a claim about interventions during fine-tuning, for instance, and you wanted to be able to make statistically significant judgments about particular interventions in the fine-tuning procedure, right? So
Maybe I could ask a slightly,
yeah,
might be the same kind of thing. So like, when I think of the goal that I want, right? So like, I'm gonna do something, make some intervention, right? And what I'll do right now is, okay, I'm gonna take a bunch of test sets, right? I'm gonna do some like pre-multi-BERTs. I'm gonna have my one pre-trained model, and I'm gonna take a bunch of test sets with replacement, and I'm gonna count up how many times did my intervention exceed my norm over those test sets, and if that number is for over 1,000 sets, and hopefully that number is less than 10 or so, and then I'm going to say, okay, with a p of 0.01 or less, then I think it is significant. Now, if I use multi-BERTs, is that going to change?
yeah. Well, so one thing is that, like, what if performing the intervention, it sort of looks statistically significant, but that's kind of just an effect of the particular parameters that you started with,
Right, sure.
which are amenable to that particular
Yeah.
intervention. So now you would be able to actually just look at the whether there's a statistically significant difference between the like pre-intervention and post-intervention
Variance from.
variance.
Yeah, right. Okay, so it's a different dimensional way of looking at
Yes.
things. Okay.
So that's why this is about robustness, because it's about whether a particular procedure or intervention is robust to like your random seeds.
And the number
the
reported in terms of
particular-
variance within a pre-training seed is what?
What the number
What
recorded.
is the thing that you report, right? Like,
Oh,
what's it
I mean,
called?
the thing that you would report is like, you can look at your mean and you can look at your variance and you can look at the like, and you can say, okay, is there like it's a hypothesis test, right? You can do a hypothesis test. Is that what you mean?
I guess I want to have like Naomi's gamma or something like that, right?
Oh,
Like, have
yeah,
a P,
no.
right? When you have a
From
thing.
multi-bootstrap.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, the alternative is like, okay, by using this multi-bootstrap procedure instead of a single bootstrap, like somehow I can get a more confident P value or something like that. I want a simple recipe.
Yeah, well, so you can say, okay, I've got a p-value, but it's like, but the difference is that you're saying I have a particular p-value sampled across that is like measuring an intervention across different seeds and not just across different data samples or whatever you want to say. So you are able to simultaneously look at all of these three, like the sources of variance that appear at each stage of the transfer learning experiment.
Okay.
Yeah. So, okay, so now we're ready to move on to this new work that is, we can say pre-training seeds, they have a actual significant impact that you can see, like some pre-training seeds tend to lead to models that are better at some particular task than others. But which means that the pre-training seed obviously has an influence. It has an inductive bias that it carries, and there's a lot of theory about where that inductive, like how that inductive bias is imposed, and in particular with respect to the loss surface, where it sort of directs your trajectory. So we're going to just talk about what happens in the loss surface and where this variance is actually expressed in terms of fine-tuning, in terms of like the strength of that bias that comes from the pre-trained parameters. So, so this is going to be talking about this paper, about linear connectivity on the loss surface and what we learn about out of distribution, out of domain generalization, just by looking at the loss surface. Because in general, we can say, okay, SGD, it finds these global optima, or at least it finds like these points that it settles in that have basically the same test performance or very similar test performance, but not all of them are robust in OOD settings. So, so the case study that we're going to start out with is in natural language inference. So this is the task where you have two sentences and one of them is your premise and one of them is your hypothesis. And you ask, okay, is the hypothesis something that can be directly inferred from the present premise? In this case, the answer is yes. But in this case, the answer would be no. So that's our task that we're working with. So McCoy et al. Found that even models that are pretty good generally on test sets like MNLI, SNLI, they end up really not doing well once you present them with test sets that violate heuristics that they might have. So if you wanted to show them something that violates a lexical overlap heuristic, for instance, you can say, okay, here is like an example where if you just assume that seeing the same words means that there is a inference there, that there's a positive match there, then you're going to be wrong. And then there's subsequence, which is if you see the same phrase, the same sequence of words consecutively, then like if you assume that that always indicates that it's a positive match, you'll be wrong. And then there's the constituent, which is like actually syntax aware heuristic. So if you assume that your actual syntactic constituent occurring in both sentences indicates a match, you'll be wrong. Yeah?
Yeah, so the question I wanted to ask is, so at this point, are you saying that did you explicitly hand pick these heuristics and add them as a feature, or you're just saying the machine was overfitting?
I am saying that what is an overfit?
Okay, okay, that's a big term. Let me say machine was probably memorizing this kind of heuristics, and we just played with it, and then in the out of domain, we showed something wrong.
So what I want to challenge, I guess, is the idea, and we can talk about this later, but the idea that any of these heuristics indicate memorization, because it turns out that models that do very well on exceptions to the constituent heuristic, for instance, that require them to be syntax aware, tend to do very poorly when challenged on lexical overlap heuristics. So I guess I would say none of these indicate necessarily memorization. They're just different generalization strategies. And I would much rather, I'll say, have a model that has a generalization strategy that indicates an awareness of syntax than one that behaves like a bag of words model. But those are just different strategies, I would say.
Again, are these strategies something which you explicitly told the machine earlier, or is it something it learned?
Oh, this is like it learns these.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay.
So it turns out that if you take so let's say you have like these three heuristics, right? Your bag of words, your position aware, or your syntax aware. So maybe this will answer that question. Sorry. So it turns out that you take a bunch of models that have all been fine-tuned with the same procedure, different fine-tuning seeds, but same procedure otherwise. And you look at these models that are all like pretty small range in terms of how well they do on like MNLI in-domain test. They have like, this is again from Mikhail et al, but a different paper. So this is just that you can see that there is significantly more variance than you would find in the in-domain set. So does that answer your question? Yeah. Okay. So the question is, what makes you have this kind of bag of words heuristic? And you said memorization, and I actually want to maybe challenge that like directly, because one of the things that people talk about when they talk about generalization versus memorization is like this idea that when you've memorized something, you're in this very like pointy little bit of the loss surface. If you've encountered this idea that like this model, if the data moves even a tiny bit, its loss is going to spike hugely. So you can visualize it as being in a very like tiny little point in the loss surface. And if the data moves at all, your loss goes up there. Whereas a like general model in this sort of framing is one that is in a more flat part of the loss surface. You're in like a nice flat region. The data moves a little bit, it's okay. You don't actually have that big of an impact. So when we're looking at this bag of words kind of generalization heuristic, and we're looking at models that tend to adhere to that kind of heuristic, is this what's going on? Is it just like in this tiny little pointy memorization optimum? It's not, basically. So if you measure epsilon sharpness, which is essentially a way of just saying like how much does the loss go up if you move a tiny amount in each direction? It's not a particularly good predictor of like, I mean, there's certainly like, and there is an anti-correlation between accuracy and like sharpness. That is to say, sharper optima have worse accuracy, which is what you'd expect, but this is not very good.
This isn't anything about BOW specifically, right?
So Hans LO is the Hans lexical overlap heuristic data set. So this is specifically about whether the model has a high accuracy on like the bag of words heuristic.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Okay.
So a model that has a worse accuracy, that indicates that it is relying on a bag of words kind of heuristic. And a model with a higher accuracy is not just using lexical overlap. Okay, so what we're going to talk about in order to talk more clearly about the loss surface is just going to be linear interpolation. So let's say you have two different models. One of them is maybe like really good at bag of words heuristic violations, and the other is not, or they're both good at it, whatever. We'll look at both cases. But in general, you are looking at an interpolation parameterized by alpha. So you're looking at something that is, let's say, very close to WA, your first model. and very far from WB, and then you would gradually move alpha closer and closer so that like you would have it be like smaller and smaller so that you would gradually be moving to WB and then you're at WB. So you're just looking at the line that connects these two models, right? So when you look at that, you can say, oh, okay, so when you look at two generalizing models, let's call them, two different models that are very good at handling heuristic violations of this sort, that are not bag of words models, then you can see that the loss really goes down between them. That actually, when you interpolate between them, you can find much better models like in domain. This is in domain. This is on the heuristic violation set, Hans LO. So, yeah.
Are they models just two models that are initialized differently, or there's something special about these models?
No, this is basically you take the 100, like you take 100 models that have all been fine-tuned the same way on MNLI with different seeds, and you take the like 5 best out of domain, like least bag of wordsy models, and you look at what happens when you interpolate between them. Okay. And they are a little bit better in the middle, it seems, at handling heuristic violations, but mainly they're just like much better in domain in between. Yeah.
Sorry, why are we talking about in domain and out of domain? Because I thought everything so far was in domain and we're only looking at heuristic violation.
I'm sorry. Yes. So the heuristic violations are out of domain. That's when I say out of domain, I mean that you're generalizing to cases where your heuristics that you have learned in domain are not applying anymore. Yeah. So this is what happens when you look at two different really bag of wordsy kind of models. This is the in-domain performance. You can see it still actually goes down quite a bit between them. It really goes down, there's a little bump, but you know, and then actually it's much better at Hans, like in the middle, but you know. And this, though, is what happens if you try to connect these two models, these two types of models. When you try to connect a generalizing model to this like bag of wordsy heuristic model, you get this huge spike in loss. You cannot really travel from one to the other without like just going way up in loss and actually going way down in accuracy at the midpoint. So basically, what this indicates to us is that these different strategies can be looked at as occupying separate basins on the loss surface. If you think about this as like that there are these, say, attractor basins, and you might end up in one, you might end up in a different one, but you can sort of move around anywhere in these basins, but you're not going to cross from one to the other, pretty much, without having to go over a huge barrier of like very high loss. And visualizing what's really happening here, these are the generalizing models. You can see that there's like not too much bump in the middle. But then if you look at a bunch of heuristic models, there's like a little more bump, which we did see. But then if you try to connect heuristic and generalizing models and you look at a plane that they share, you take a cut plane that they share, you can see that there is this really huge barrier right in the middle of extremely high loss that intrudes onto the connections between them. So, yeah.
So I probably need to just ask this question a couple more times. Okay, so the models themselves are just initialized from a different starting point, et cetera. And the reason that you can call a model a heuristic model is because it's doing well on elements that you know are licensed by a particular syntactic heuristic.
That it does poorly when the heuristic
is violated. Okay,
yes.
Great. So and a generalized model just doesn't ever do particularly poorly on any of the heuristics? Or
at least it does well on
the Hans test.
Yeah, on this particular subset of Hans. Right now, we're focusing only on lexical overlap, but we will talk about other heuristics.
Okay, but one of the heuristics you did mention was like syntactic structure thing. But another heuristic could be semantic graphs are the same, right? Which would Semantic graphs don't contain a contradiction, right? Which would then be the task, right?
Well, but there's, so there is like a, it doesn't have to contain, well, so, okay, so, I mean, a couple of things. One of them is, you know, you have contradiction, you have match, and then you have just like an unmatched pair that is neither contradicting nor inferred. So, so it's not enough to say this doesn't contain a contradiction.
No, but there's 3 categories in NLI.
Yeah, yeah, well, in this case, we're really looking at, yeah, so.
My point is, can you make your heuristic equal to the task?
Can you make your heuristic equal to the task?
The heuristic, it seems like defined, I guess, somewhat arbitrarily, and like you could make it.
I mean, there is, I guess you could say, like, can you, like, you could say the heuristic is this, like, does this model get this right?
Yeah.
Like, okay. I guess you could say that, but I would not refer to that as a heuristic because this is like what we're investigating is sort of shortcut learning, right? So so there is some procedure that the model is doing in order to get to the actual underlying task.
Yeah, I
Right.
mean, I can argue the difference between a task and I mean, isn't every learning a heuristic in some way?
Sure. I mean, you can always say that in any kind of situation where there's like shortcut learning. But like of any sort, you can say, okay, but like that's only a shortcut because we happen to have labeled it because we've misdefined the task and actually it should be a bag of words, like word counting task. I mean, you could say that, but I think then you can't really discuss out of domain generalization effectively or shortcut learning effectively, like unless you're actually able to point to a particular shortcut that models tend to rely on that is undesirable.
Okay.
I don't know. I mean,
Sure.
Yeah.
Can I add, like, is there something that breaks down if you do that assumption? Is that like why you're asking, or?
I'm still trying to get to the root of like how these things got defined and pulled aside, but I feel like it could get into a philosophy discussion, which I don't want.
Yeah. I mean, the main thing I think is that you have, is that you can look, like I was saying before, you can look at these as different strategies for accomplishing whatever our objective is, which in this case is NLI, right? So you can use different strategies that are not always going to work because they're based on whatever heuristic they're based on. Yeah.
Yeah, I think what John is trying to say here is every task could be defined as created from a bunch of heuristics, and it's a human being. In this case, we decided that this particular heuristics, the machine possibly is using this particular heuristic of semantic overlap, and let's check for that. But that is not completely true, that we don't know what the machine is doing at the end of the day. We as linguistics are assuming maybe this is what's happening. And he's just wondering, why are we picking those heuristics and not just say the task itself?
Well, because I do actually have some, I can show you something on the actual paper, in the actual paper itself that is looking at behavior in domain. There are situations where it makes sense to say, oh, this is like where we don't have particular heuristic generalization behavior that is clear, that is like a better like predictor than just in domain performance. But there are other situations where, and there are other situations where there is a like real, in particular, COLA, which I will briefly talk about, but in the case of COLA, like, you know, you train 50 models on, and one of them is in like its own little basin, and that one model is extremely different, is like significantly higher out of domain performance, like it's the best out of domain performance, but in domain, it's basically in the middle, it's basically average. So I think there are cases where we have effectively, where I think we have like effectively proposed out of domain heuristics that when violated do actually correspond to this kind of basin, like this kind of loss surface behavior. Whereas in other situations, we find that that out of domain behavior is not really any better or is worse than in domain behavior as a predictor for these geometric properties of the loss surface. So I think, does that answer the question, I guess? Basically, there are a variety of heuristics and generalization strategies a model might adhere to, and any one that we propose is unlikely to be the like truth about what the model is doing, but there are cases where they are better predictors than just looking at raw performance in domain, and there are cases where they are worse predictors than looking at performance in domain. Yeah. So to sort of like formalize this or to quantify this behavior that we're looking at in the loss surface, this basin membership, we're going to talk about these barriers that intrude on the interpolation lines between models. So you can measure, this is like an existing method from Intezari et al. That you can just look at, basically this is, if you know like Jensen's inequality, this is a Jensen gap. Essentially, you look at the average between like the performance of the average, and you look at the average of the performances, and you look at the difference between that. You look at what is the difference between, like, if you were to assume that there's just a linear, like that there's a linear relation, that like that the loss itself is going to be a straight line between these two endpoints, like how big is the difference between this and that assumption of just like perfectly linear relation between like where you've interpolated and the like loss that is produced. So then in order to talk about this like across a line rather than just like across a line segment, in order to talk about this along the entire function, along this entire interpolation, we're really looking at this convexity gap, which is just like, what's the maximum Jensen gap or barrier height at any segment of the line in between? Because if you'll recall, we when we were looking at these, this isn't that much higher than these, but it's a lot higher than these minimum points interpolating in between them. So that's where we can say that a particular interpolation is giving us a function that's like mostly convex or like really not even close to convex, depending on how big the barriers that you find along that interpolation are. And so if you look at this convexity gap metric and you measure the convexity gap between each pair of models out of 100 models that do NLI, and then you sort them according to performance on the like bag of words heuristic set, you find that actually like these are the ones that are the worst at, these are the bag of words models over here, and they are very connected to each other and completely disconnected from the rest of the models on the loss surface. And then if you want to look at another heuristic, if you look at that constituent heuristic, it turns out that all of the models that are really like, all of those models that are really bad, those models that are totally disconnected from everything else, that are really bag of wordsy models that are really bad at the lexical overlap heuristic set, they're really good at the constituent overlap set. So they are able to handle situations that the syntax aware models are not really able to handle, because they are just relying on this heuristic of constituent overlap. And you can't really say it's just, oh, maybe it's just that some of these are aware of the position and others aren't aware of the position, because this is what the subsequence looks like. It's like, yeah, there's like patterns, but it's not really the kind of strong patterns that you see with the other heuristics, where there's like a clear difference in terms of basin membership between better and worse models at those heuristics. So if you do spectral clustering in the space defined by this convexity gap, so meaning that you are identifying these separate basins where basically you have like a cluster in one basin where all of these models are connected, and a cluster in the other basin where all of these models are connected and they're connected components that are disconnected from each other. Like, that's a pretty strong predictor of accuracy on the lexical overlap set. Yes?
We have 5 minutes.
Oh, yeah. Let's see how good we can do here. Okay. So next question, is this just a thing that happens with NLI? So we can look at paraphrase. Paraphrase has its own, like, we can use pause, which is also another, like, basically another lexical permutation kind of based thing. So it's sort of testing whether it's using just lexical overlap to detect paraphrases. And this also has pretty strong, has like a pretty strong effect, although, and like we can talk about this after offline, but it's actually not as strong as in-domain in this case. So I would say that this is a case where maybe we wouldn't say that we've found like a really good heuristic that that defines the basins. So, but you can see like it's predictive in the cluster space, and it's like very visible that this is a thing that's happening. And then we can say, okay, well, maybe it's just lexical permutation that's happening. Maybe it's just like sometimes, like lexical permutation is the thing that defines which basin you end up in. But in the case of COLA, which is just a linguistic acceptability judgment task, the out of domain test set in this case is just like you're using examples that come from different linguistics papers that describe different phenomena. So they're not just unseen examples from the same linguistics papers, but they're from completely different linguistics papers. So that's sort of like testing whether let's say the model has learned the concept of acceptability in some more, let's say, fundamental way than just learning these individual like cases of what is acceptable and what is not. And in this case, you train like 50 of these, you only really have one that's like kind of in its own basin a bit, but it is like the best at the OOD set. And it's pretty much like right in the middle in terms of in-domain performance.
Wait, what is the OOD set?
The OOD set is just like, it's COLA's official OOD set, which is just like from a different set of linguistics papers than the training set is taken from. So like the in-domain set is looking at the same phenomena, but unseen examples of the same phenomena from the same linguistics papers. The OOD set is different linguistics papers, like not the same phenomena, but the same general idea of this is acceptable or unacceptable in English. Okay, so one last thing, since we have 2 minutes, is are these basins actually like acting as attractors? Do they trap a training trajectory, or is it like, oh, some of these are just taking longer than others? So you are in one basin, that's the like lexical, like that's the bag of words basin, and eventually you acquire syntactic behavior, eventually. Like you're not getting drawn further into the attractor basin, right? But it turns out that like, actually, if you're very central, if you're like one of these like pretty central bag of words models that's very disconnected from the rest and very connected to the other bag of words models, you just go deeper and deeper into, like, yes, if you're marginally a bag of words model, you transition more to the syntax aware side. But if you're like really central to this cluster, if you're in that basin, really central, you just become more and more central to the cluster. This is centroid distance in the spectral clustering space. Yeah.
So what you're saying so far is there is no such thing as one single best model. It's always better to have different models and maybe let them vote each other for a particular task.
If they vote, you get the, well, if they vote linearly, you get the problem, right?
Yeah. So this is like, if you look at model soups, for instance, whoops. That's fine. All right. If you look at model soups, for instance, which is a method of like just taking weight averages as a way of ensembling, essentially, there's like a lot of ensembling methods based on weight averaging. And yeah, those you cannot do in NLP, it turns out. And people have been like, why doesn't this always work in NLP? So I'm proposing a possible explanation here, which is that it doesn't work when you're looking at multiple basins, right? So the takeaways. Transfer learning does actually introduce new sources of variance relative to previous methods. And you need to analyze a larger number of models if you want to understand that influence. And it is actually like modifying training paths on the lost surface, which is how transfer learning really works. It's picking particular basins, it's imposing a prior over those basins, but there are multiple basins and they do determine out of domain behavior. Yeah, so I guess right now it is exactly 3 o'clock, but we can talk. What?
There's usually a little time for questions.
Okay, go ahead. Yeah.
So do you know if the basin type itself is correlated specifically to a particular initial seed? So like if I was a lexical overlap basin for this task, I'm going to be a lexical overlap basin for this other test?
Good question. I'm not sure about that. Certainly there are like particular hyperparameters that seem to determine the like prior over basins, both like which basin is more likely to be selected and what is the amount of variance over the basins that are selected. But I'm not sure about like whether a single fine-tuning seed, because part of it, of course, is the seed for the training order of the data as well, which isn't something that is going to generalize across tasks.
Right.
But that's a good question. I'm not sure whether a particular like fine-tuning layer seed generalizes.
I'm with the pre-training, right? So like this is all comes out of mBERTs, right?
Oh yeah, okay.
So
yeah.
right, so there's like 25, you said mBERTs is, right? So you can imagine like, oh, this is the lexical one. Oh, this is the syntax one.
Oh yeah, so the second half of this doesn't actually look at, we have been looking at different like multiverts, but there's an extra complication once you're looking across different pre-training seeds, which is that the neurons aren't necessarily aligned across like different models that are taken from different seeds. So you need to first like align or permute the actual like neurons. Because if you think about it, there's like there are several there's like however many isomorphic like models that have the same set of neurons, but they are differently ordered, but they're like isomorphic because they're going to produce the same output because you know you're it's just like that you've reordered your vectors at whatever layer, right? So in that situation, you really can't take averages straightforwardly without first aligning the neurons. So these are all things that are like not done in this work, but yeah, good question.
Okay, if anybody who have questions, those who joined via Zoom, please unmute and ask. Okay, looks like no questions from Zoom. Thank you everyone for joining this talk. Let's thank Naomi for this. Peter, can stop recording.